Hi, everybody. This is Mike, and today I want to talk to you about SSI's Plan to Achieve Self-Support or PASS plan. And if you've been a WISA or a VR counselor for a while, you probably know at minimum that SSI's PASS is a way for people on SSI to set aside some savings to pay for work-related expenses. And what I'm going to do today is kind of dig into that a little bit more. We'll talk about what PASS plans are, how people qualify, and how to actually help a person set up a plan if they qualify. And I wanted to do this because I have a past webinar that I did a couple years ago that's a little bit outdated now. Some of the calculations are outdated, and I've gotten a lot of questions from WISAs and VR counselors related to PASS. So I just wanted to kind of do an updated webinar to address some of those questions. So let's talk a little bit about what PASS is. First of all, it's important to understand that PASS is an SSI only work incentive. So if people are on something like SSDI, they wouldn't be able to qualify for a PASS plan unless they were able to use that plan to qualify for some SSI. And I'll talk about how a client can do that in a few minutes when we go through an example. But keep in mind that if somebody is a feasible candidate for a PASS plan, they have to either be already receiving SSI at the time they set the plan up, or at least can become eligible for SSI later. And again, I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. What PASS does is it allows individuals on SSI to set aside income or resources to pay for items and services needed to reach a work goal. And one of the most important things to understand about a PASS plan is that money set aside in a PASS does not count against the SSI check or the benefit amount. And as you probably know, and as a general rule, if somebody has unearned income like Social Security disability, or they might have a veteran's benefit or a pension, or if they're working and have earnings, even after exclusions, a certain amount of that money is going to count against the SSI check and cause it to go down. What PASS does is it allows Social Security to exempt or not count the money that's put into the PASS against the SSI check. And what Social Security will actually do then is increase the person's check dollar by dollar by the amount of money they put aside into that plan up into the federal benefit rate for SSI. And we'll go through some examples in a few minutes. But some examples of allowable expenses that people can commonly use a pass for are things like transportation. If they need a vehicle modification, say, for example, they can't drive a regular car because of their disability and they need a hand control put in, or they might need a wheelchair lift put into their van. Those are examples of allowable transportation expenses. Sometimes people can even use a pass to pay for a used vehicle to get back and forth to work. Home modifications are something that commonly uh, pass is used for. So, for example, if somebody uh, lived in a home that wasn't wheelchair accessible, but then they became disabled later and they needed uh, modifications to the home, maybe they needed modifications to a bathtub, or maybe they needed modifications to the doorways to get the wheelchair in and out. Those are examples of allowable pass expenses because without the home modifications, they wouldn't be able to get in and out and they might not be able to work. If somebody has education costs related to a work goal, say they're in a college or university and they have costs related to tuition, books, fees related to going to school, those are allowable past expenses because obviously without that education and training, they wouldn't be able to get a job in their career of choice. And so education expenses are commonly an example of an approved past expenditure. Even things that people need on the job, like clothing and meals that they eat at work are allowable past expenses. Anything that is reasonably work related that a client has to pay for out of pocket could potentially qualify for a pass. So these are examples of some common expenditures. It's by no means an all-inclusive list. What I've done is I've given you a link to the POMs at the bottom of the slide here. I'm not going to take the time to go there for time's sake, but you can take the time later to go through the POMs if you want to. It's a more inclusive list of some of the most common types of expenses that Social Security allows a client to use pass funds for. So let's talk about who is the best candidate for a pass. Again, going back to what I said on a previous slide, they must either be receiving SSI or at least qualify for it using a pass plan. And again, I'll talk about that more in a minute. They have to have expenses related to a work goal. Okay, so they have to have expenses related to getting a job in their career of choice, whether it be, again, transportation, education expenses, home modifications, all those examples I just went through qualify as work-related expenses, but they have to have expenses related to a work goal that they have to pay for out of pocket. They have to have some other income or resources other than SSI to put aside. So that could be anything from under an income like SSDI, or pensions or veterans benefits, or it could be resources that they might have on hand in excess of the $2,000 resource limit, or it could be wages. But they have to have some other income or resources other than SSI to be a feasible pass candidate. If you have a client who is on SSI only and they have no other income or resources to set aside into the pass, they're not going to be a feasible candidate because they have to have other income or resources to set aside. They have to be able to meet all their living expenses on an SSI check and money left out of the pass. So what does that mean? In screening whether or not a client is a feasible candidate for the pass, I'll talk a little bit about this more later on, but one of the things that OWISA would have to do is to go through the client's monthly income and expenses to determine how much they can afford to set aside and still meet all their monthly living expenses. If you have a client who for example, has a SSDI check of $1,800 a month, and their expenses are $1,800 a month, they're not going to be a feasible pass candidate because they have no extra money to set aside into a pass to save up for those expenses. All the money they have coming in is going out in bills and other expenses. So that's an example of when somebody might not be a feasible candidate for pass because they have to have money to both meet their expenses and save up for the expenses related to their work goal to be a feasible pass candidate. And again, we'll go through an example in a few minutes. Lastly, when Social Security determines if a client is feasible for a pass, they have to determine whether or not the work goal is feasible and attainable. So in other words, it has to be realistic. And I'll give you an example of that. Back when I was doing direct services, I had a client who had a mental health disability and wanted to write a pass because his vocational goal was to be a NASCAR race car driver. And so his pass was related to um, wanting to save up for the race car and all the modifications that he would need to it. I knew that Social Security likely wasn't going to approve that because it wasn't a feasible and attainable goal. I didn't want to come out and say that, so what I did rather was talk to him about other careers that he was interested in that were a little bit more realistic and geared his path toward that work goal. Okay, so the work goal has to be something that's feasible and attainable, something that a person can do despite their disability, and something that they can actually achieve in order for Social Security to consider them a feasible pass candidate. So let's get into an example and I can show you how some of the calculations work. So on this slide, I have the example of Pam, and Pam has a disability and receives $1,000 a month in Social Security disability income, or SSDI. Okay. So remember, for 2024, the maximum SSI rate is 943. So her SSDI check is slightly higher than that. So she's not currently receiving SSI at the moment. She's been going to school for nursing with DARS support, and while DARS has been assisting her with tuition and textbooks, her maximum grant still doesn't cover all of her expenses. With the additional textbooks, tuition, and lab fees, she estimates that she'll need about $1,000 per semester extra. So that's on top of what DARS is sponsoring. She lives with a roommate and pays a flat fee of $500 a month for her rent and food. And it's difficult for her to make ends meet, so she doesn't know how she'll save any money. Okay, so let's step back and take a look at this. She's got $1,000 a month coming in SSDI. Half of the income that she has coming in every month goes for rent and food, but she has $1,000 per semester extra that she needs to shell out for books and fees and stuff like that. So how is she going to be able to do that when she's only got $500 a month left after expenses? This is where the pass would come in. So she talks with her benefits specialist, in other words, in her WISA, about a pass plan. And they determine that she can afford to set $350 a month into the plan by the time the new semester comes. So, assuming that she sets aside that 350 for 3 months, she'll have roughly $1,050 banked. Pam is not receiving any SSI at this time, again, because her income is over the 943 threshold. She is $57 over. So let's look at how Social Security would calculate her income and determine how much SSI she was eligible for if she had a pass plan in place. So the first thing they're going to do always, and this is something that should be familiar to all of you, is they're not going to count the first $20 of her unearned income, i.e. her SSDI. With that $20 exclusion, as an unearned income exclusion, she's still $37 over SSI eligibility. So even though Social Security takes that $20 off, they don't count, her SSDI is still a little bit too high to qualify for an SSI check. But let's look at how the example changes with an approved pass plan. If she were able to put aside $350 a month into a pass, that money wouldn't count toward her SSI. What that does then is it reduces the amount of money that Social Security counts against an SSI check by $350, allowing her to become SSI eligible. Okay. So let's look at how that calculation is going to work. Again, they're going to take the $1,000 a month in SSDI that she's got coming in. They don't count the first $20 of it as an unearned income exclusion. And then, assuming the pass gets approved at a rate of allowing her to save $350 a month, they're also not going to count an additional $350 a month of her SSDI that she's putting into that plan to save up for her education expenses. That brings her countable income down to $630. Okay. So she has $650 a month in SSDI that she has not put into the plan. And she's got $284 in SSI. Okay. How did I come up with that? So, as you know from doing SSI calculations, that Social Security is always going to take the base SSI amount. So this year is $943, and they're going to subtract from that $630 that she has in countable income. That's how I came up with the $284. Okay, it's SSDI minus any countable income from the 943. That's how they come up with the SSI check. Okay. So she's got SSI of 284, and she's got 650 in SSDI that she didn't put into the pass. Okay. So she's got $963 per month to meet her living expenses. Okay. So with an approved pass plan, what they're doing is actually exempting some of her income in SSI or SSDI that they're not counting against the SSI check, and they're giving her an SSI supplement to supplement some of the money that she put aside. That's the goal of the pass. That's an example of how somebody that might not be an SSI yet because of income can qualify for it and make themselves a feasible pass candidate. So let's go back to what we talked about before. She has a feasible work goal. That's a check. And she's going to school for nursing. She has expenses related to her college that are related to a work goal. Check. She can still meet her monthly living expenses with the money that she leaves out of the pass because she's got $963 per month to meet her living expenses. Her living expenses are only $500. So she's actually got enough money to both save money into a pass plan to save up for her expenses and meet her living expenses. So that's a check. So she's has a feasible work goal, has expenses, and can meet her monthly living expenses um, using a pass plan. So it looks like she might be a feasible candidate. So let's talk about what happens once a client is determined to be a feasible candidate. Let's talk about what the pass actually looks like. So pass plans must be submitted in writing to Social Security. And in order to be considered for a pass plan, a client must fill out the form 545BK, which is the actual plan for achieving self-support. And let's take a few minutes to actually go through it. I have a link to it in the slide here. Just 1 second, I'll pull that up. So what I have up on the screen now is the SSI 545BK. This is the actual plan to achieve self-support plan. And I wanted to take a couple minutes to just kind of go through it and uh, talk about some of the different parts and what needs to go into making a plan feasible. So the first part is part A. Social Security is asking client to detail in this section what their work goal is. So going back to our example of Pam, it would be she's going to school to be a nurse, and show the job that you expect to have at the end of the plan. Okay. One of the things to keep in mind about PASS is the reason why it's called Plan to Achieve Self-Support is because Social Security expects at the end of the plan that the client will be earning enough to work their way off of all cash benefits. So if you're a WISA and you're listening to this and you're helping a client determine whether or not they're a feasible candidate, in order for Social Security to approve a PASS plan, remember that you have to project earnings that are high enough to be over SGA and over the SSI earnings limit in order for Social Security to approve it. So, for example, working as a nurse, if she was able to get a full-time job, she might make $3,000 to $3,500 a month or whatever it is. But in order for Social Security to approve it, remember, you have to project those earnings a little bit high um, to show that the client is capable of working and earning enough to work their way out cash benefits in order for it to be approved. If a client tells you that they have no intention of working at a level where they're not going to give up their cash benefits, they're probably not going to be a feasible candidate. They have to have a long-term goal of working out benefits. It doesn't mean that it has to happen right away. Sometimes people can start off part-time and they give themselves time to get acclimated to the job, see if they're able to handle it. And sometimes, if the job goes well at part-time, clients can work their way up to full-time work and work their way off benefits gradually. So it doesn't have to happen right away for the past plan to be approved, but it has to be at least a long-term goal that once the past plan is over, the client's going to be able to capable of earning that higher check and working their way out benefits. So just keep that in mind. Question 2 talks about if the person is going to be self-employed, and keep in mind that pass is available for people who are self-employed also. If a client has a self-employment goal, um, one of the things Social Security is going to want to see, and one of the things they're going to ask them to attach to their plan, is a copy of their business plan. Maybe they developed a business plan with a Small Business Administration, or maybe they developed one with DARS support. But if the goal is related to self-employment, Social Security is going to want to see a copy of that business plan. Question 3 asks about job coaching, yes or no. Do they have those services? Question 5 asks about what sort of duties do you expect to perform in the job? And this is where the labor market information might come in handy. Sometimes a client might have a specific job goal, but they're not too sure about what the education requirements are for the job goal or what the job might entail. So this would be a good example of a time if you're helping somebody put together a past plan, to pull up the client's career of choice from like ONET or Virginia Career View, because as you know, part of that is listing some of the specific job duties of the job and the salary ranges. So uh, that labor market information might be really helpful as you're putting together part one of a past plan in terms of projecting what a client's earnings potential is in the job if they were to get a job in their career of choice, and also giving you some examples of some of the common job duties that they're expected to perform once they start working. So keep that in mind. Does your work require a special certificate or license? For example, if somebody had a VR goal of becoming a CDL driver, obviously there's a special license for that. So they would check yes there. Okay. How did you decide on this work goal, and what makes this type of work attractive to you? Okay. That's a pretty straightforward question. Basically, the client would just talk about why they want to work in that particular job, why they chose that career. Going back to our example of Pam, she could say something like, well, I'm interested in nursing because my mother was a nurse, and I saw how good it made her feel to help people, and I want to follow in the same career path. I've always wanted to help people, and that's why I want to be a nurse, because um I just have the desire to help, or whatever, however you want to word it, but that's just an example of how to answer that question. Okay, so then they're going to ask, how much money do you expect to earn before any deductions? So again, going back to the labor market information that you might pull if you're a WISA helping a client put together a pass, you would put projected earnings of working 40 hours a week in the nursing field there, whatever that is. Have you ever been previously approved for a pass? Yes or no? It's a pretty self-explanatory question. And if no, it says skip to the next section. So let's go there. So part B is a little bit of information about the client's disabling illnesses, injuries, or conditions. This is where you would talk about what the client's disability is. what they're receiving benefits for, that sort of nature. If they have a physical disability, Social Security is going to want to know about any limitations that they might have that might impede their ability to do the work. For example, that they have limitations in terms of how far they can walk or stand at a particular time, or do they have limitations about how much they can sit during the day? Sometimes people need to get up and walk around, that sort of thing. Or they also ask about additional limitations. It might not be a physical disability. They might have a another kind of impairment where they have limitations with being able to work around a lot of people, or stress management issues, or things like that. So this is where you talk about any kind of limitations that the person might have in terms of work relating to their job goal. And if they do have such limitations, how you would address the limitations so that the client can reach the work goal. And when I was doing direct services and I got to this question, I would questions a lot of the time from clients. It says, well, I do have stress management issues. How am I going to handle the job? And this is an example of where you might say, well, you'd work with the employer to set up a reasonable accommodation. So if somebody can't stand for a long period of time, the reasonable accommodation might be to allow them to sit for a period of time while they're at work. Or if they have a stress management problem and they can't work around a lot of people, a reasonable accommodation might be allowing a client to take a frequent break to kind of decompress and de-stress. Okay, so an example of how a client might be able to do the work despite their limitations is working with the employer to set up the right accommodations to make the job more feasible. Next section, it talks a little bit about the jobs that the client has had and what their title was, what type of business, and when they worked there. Social Security is going to want to know about the highest grade of school they completed. Did they graduate high school? Did they have any college? If so, if they went to college, you would list the type of degree and the field of study. And when they graduated, do they have any type of training, trade school? Do they have any certificates or licenses already that they can use in pursuit of their work goal? Yes or no? And if they do, you would list those there. And and then it says, if you have education or training experience, why do you need additional training to achieve a work goal? So an example of that could be maybe somebody has an associate's degree, but in order to work in their career of choice, they might need a bachelor's degree or higher. So, they might have some college or some, credentials, but in this day and age, often people need higher than an associate's degree to be competitive in a job. So that's how you'd answer that question. I have an associate's degree now, but in order to be more competitive to an employer, I want to pursue ongoing education to get a bachelor's degree or higher. That's an example of how to answer that. Do you have a ticket to work? Yes or no? And a lot of the time, if you're a whistle listening to this, and you're working with a client who's receiving services from DARS, you know that if a client is receiving services from DARS, their ticket to work is assigned to us until such time that their case closes. So if they do have a ticket and assignment, you check yes there, and if they're currently active with DARS, you would put down the contact information for the VR counselor. Part C actually talks about what the client's actual plan is. Okay. So this is where you would list the steps in that the client would have to take in order to actually achieve a work goal. So for example, they've given you a couple examples here. Let's go back to our example of Pam. she's in college. She's looking to use the pass to pay for education expenses apart from what DARS covers. So they give you an example here of the first step in achieving your work goal is to enroll in college. This says spring 2012. So let's change it to spring 2024. So you put that down. The first step in achieving my work goal is to enroll in college for spring 2024. I'm going to be taking 12 credits per semester, and then you would list when the semester begins and when the semester ends. Okay. And as the client goes through school, you would list each semester there they are planning to enroll in school, when that is going to begin or end. Or if a person has completed school and they're at the point where they're ready to look for a job, you would list those steps there. So for example, updating resume could be a step on the past plan. Filling out applications could be a step on the past plan. Going on interviews. I have a goal of going on maybe 3 interviews a month or whatever it is. Those are the sequential kind of steps that Social Security is going to be looking for when determining whether or not this is a feasible plan. So when you get to the point where they ask about the plan, just remember it's kind of a step-by-step process detailing um, how the client's going to reach their goal, whether they are in school or whether they're at a point where they're ready to look for a job. You would list the steps that they need to take in order to get there. Okay. Part D asks about expenses. And this is where Social Security is going to ask, what expenses does the client need to reach their work goal and how much they're going to cost? So, going back to our example of Pam, we estimated that she's going to have roughly $1,000 a month per semester for tuition, books, and fees, apart from what DARS covers. So, if you were working with Pam, that's what you would list here. The item, service, or training would be tuition. The provider would be the institution where she's going to school. The frequency of payment would be quarterly, and she would be paying that every 3 months. And the total cost would be $1,000. That's what she projected. When will you pay for these items or services? That would be once the past plan was approved and she was able to save enough money where she could draw out of that to meet those expenses. How will these items or services help you reach your work goal? Okay, so one of the things that Social Security is going to ask you is not only what is the client's work goal, what expenses do they need, how much are they going to cost, but how are they going to help them reach the goal? Well, in Pam's case, we said she was going to school to be a nurse, and obviously, without paying for that tuition, she's not going to get her degree. So you can keep the explanations very simple. And sometimes it's like, uh, my goal is to be a nurse, and I'm going to school, and without paying my tuition, I wouldn't be able to graduate, and I wouldn't have the credentials I need to meet my work goal when I graduate. So that's an example of explaining how the item or service is needed. You can kind of keep those uh, pretty simple. A lot of it's just common sense. But you would fill out that for every expense that the client has that they want Social Security to consider, you would need to talk about what the expense is, how much it's going to cost, when it's going to be paid, and how it helps the client reach the goal. Okay. Next question asks, will any other person or organization pay for any of the expenses listed in the plan? Now, going back to our example of Pam, we said that she was receiving some support from DARS. So if you were working with somebody like her that's receiving assistance from VR or another organization, you would say yes. She does have some expenses related to tuition, books, and fees that VR is covering. So it says who will pay. You would put dollars down there, for example. The item or service would be tuition and books, the amount that DARS is paying. One of the things that would be helpful for you if you are a WISA helping a client who's a DARS client put together a pass plan is to ask the counselor for a copy of the person's individualized plan for employment or their IPE, because that kind of breaks down what items or services DARS is covering to help a client reach their work goal and how much they're paying. So that would kind of help you when you get to this section determine what items or services DARS is already covering and how much we're paying for those services. So if you're working with a client who's already working with DARS, utilize the counselor as a resource to help you kind of put together the plan in terms of figuring out what DARS is paying for and how much. Part E is funding for the PASS plan. Do you plan to use any items or services you already own to reach your work goal? And if yes, list the items and the value. So that might be an example of maybe she's taken some online classes and she's got a laptop already. She might list that she's got a laptop that she's going to use for her classes. A straightforward example of items that she might already use to help her reach her goal. Okay. And then you talk about what income that she's got coming in other than SSI. Again, remember that she's going to use to fund her plan. So they give you some examples of income that can be used. SSDI, earned income wages, income from self-employment or other. Other might be resources above the $2,000 resource limit that they can put into the PASS plan. But again, they have to have some other income other than SSI coming in. So going back to Pam's example, we said that she was going to put aside $350 a month of her SSDI into the PASS plan. So when you get to the section on funding the plan, if you're working with Pam, you would put aside $350 in SSDI monthly. So that's what you would write on the plan there. Okay. Or if a client had wages or any other income, you'd put that there as well. How much they were going to put aside and how often. Usually they're going to contribute to the PASS on a monthly basis. Like, for example, going back to Pam, she was going to set aside $350 a month. Section F asks about the client's current living expenses. This is where doing a budget with a client would come in handy. And I'm not going to take the time to go through every single line of the budget. You all know what a budget looks like, but obviously the biggest expenses are going to be rent or mortgage and food, utilities, that sort of stuff. So this is where you would list how much the client has going out every month in those expenses. Okay. And then it asks for household expenses and personal expenses. How much do they pay for recreation, clothing, any additional expenses beyond the standard household ones. You'd list them all here and how much they were every month. They have any installment payments, credit card accounts, auto loans, monthly recurring expenses like that. Those would all be listed here. And then at the bottom, you just total up everything you listed for household expenses, installment payments, and any recreation or expenses above that. That all gets added up and totaled at the bottom. Part G is other contacts. Social Security is going to ask if the client had any help in developing the plan. So if you were the WISA helping a client um, develop the plan and you wanted to talk to Social Security about it, you would put your information down there as the person helping a client develop the plan. And then Social Security could follow up with you if they need any further information or any questions they have about the plan as they're reviewing it. Part H is just additional remarks. So this would allow a client to make any additional remarks that weren't already covered in previous parts of the plan. The next part is just an agreement that the client has to sign. It just says, I authorize SSA to contact the persons or organizations listed in Part G of the plan for additional information about my pass. So if you're a WISA helping a client put together the pass plan and you put your contact information there, you don't need a separate release because the client's going to sign this agreement at the bottom. And that is essentially the release allowing Social Security to talk to you. So if they need further information about any information in the pass plan, any of the estimates put down, um, then um, then Social Security would be able to talk to you about that. This is just where the client puts all their information, signs at the bottom. If they have a payee, the payee is also going to have to sign there and put their contact information in. And the last page is just a privacy statement. Page 12 is a receipt that the client would hold on to, just verifying that the SSA has received a copy of the completed pass, and and at the bottom of the page, it just reminds people of their responsibilities as the pass is ongoing. So they have to report certain things to Social Security. So if their medical condition improves, they might not be eligible for benefits anymore. That's something that they want to let Social Security know about. If something happens where they're unable to follow the plan that they laid out, that would be something that a client would have to report. So, for example, if a client was working maybe part-time and they were putting some wages aside and then they lose their job, obviously they don't have those wages to put into the pass anymore. So they're going to have to call up Social Security and let them know I'm not going to be able to follow my plan right now because I lost the money I was putting aside into the pass. I need to put my pass on hold. So one thing to remember about the pass that's really important is that passes are not ever set in stone. They can be amended at any time in writing, or they can sometimes be put on hold or suspended if a client has an issue where they're not able to follow through with the plan by the dates they thought they were going to complete it. Maybe they have a exacerbation of symptoms, or again, they lose their job, or something happens to impede their ability to follow that plan. Social Security is not going to hold that against them as long as they communicate any changes like that with them. So if a client can't follow the plan as written, or if there needs to be an amendment to it. An example of an amendment could be a client realizing that they can't afford to put as much money into the past plan as they thought they would, and they want to put less aside, or maybe they want to put more aside. They can always amend that at any time if the amendment is done in writing. Okay. One last thing I want to say about the actual pass plan itself is going back to the section on where Social Security asks about the expenses related to the client's work goals. So let's go back up there really quickly. This will be 1 minute to get back up to the right section. Okay. So again, this is part D on page 4. And this is again where you're going to list all the client's monthly expenses or the client's expenses related to getting to achieving a work goal. And again, Social Security is going to ask how much these items or services cost. Now going back to Pam's example of tuition and expenses, she's going to have a flat fee that's charged by the institution. But sometimes clients are going to have expenses that vary. For example, if they wanted to buy a new computer and software because they're getting a job working from home, let's say, and they don't have the money outright to buy the computer, they got to save up for it. You, as the list of helping a client put the plan together, would put down that the item or service is a computer and the cost of it. Okay. Now, when it's a service that can be furnished by different providers, Social Security is going to often ask the client to gather at least 2 or 3 estimates for the service. So, for example, if it was a computer, Social Security would say, okay, we want you to do a little bit of shopping around. You can look on Amazon, Walmart, and let's say Best Buy. The client would be responsible for gathering up those estimates and attaching it with the pass plan. Okay. So, usually Social Security would ask a client to look for 2 or 3 estimates for a similar service, a comparable service from 3 different providers, and usually they'll approve the lowest amount. Okay. So if, for example, um, a client was saving for a computer, and on Amazon it was 1,500, Walmart it was 1,400, but they could get it at Best Buy for 1,300. Social Security is going to want them to get the computer from Best Buy for 1,300 because that's the lowest estimate. So if it's an expense that can be offered by various providers, keep in mind that the client often has to shop around for estimates, and Social Security is gonna usually approve the plan to get the expense from the vendor with the lowest estimate. Okay. Similar to when somebody wants to use a pass to purchase a used vehicle. Obviously, Social Security is not going to allow approve a pass plan to allow a client to buy a new BMW. That's not going to happen. Usually, what they'll do though is allow the client to save up enough to buy a used, um, reliable vehicle. It's not going to be something new. It could be something older with a lot of miles on it, but something reliable that will get them back and forth to work. If it's an example of a client using a pass plan to pay for a down payment or monthly payments on a vehicle, Social Security is going to want the client to also shop around, do some estimates, some comparison shopping from 2 to 3 different car dealerships for a similar vehicle, and then Social Security is going to probably approve the pass plan, um, to get the car from the vendor with the lowest quote. Okay. So keep in mind, um, as the WISA helping a client put the plan together, is that it's not your responsibility to do the comparison shopping for them when they have expenses that can be used or utilized from multiple vendors. The client has to put some work into, in terms of doing the shopping around and gathering all their estimates. Your job is to help them complete the paperwork and submit it to Social Security, but your job is not to do all the work for them. The client is responsible for like putting together their own budget and determining what their monthly expenses are every month. They can determine how much they can afford to set aside, and they're responsible for coming up with some estimates too when they have expenses um, that can be provided from multiple vendors. So just remember, as the WISA, your job is not to do everything for them. You're helping with the paperwork, filling out the paperwork and submitting it, but the client has to put in some effort too. And sometimes, like in my experience doing direct services, I know that one of the hangups that clients often had was they thought, oh, I can get approved for this pass plan and I'll have free money. But then when I started to tell them things like, well, we have to come up with a budget and determine how much you can afford to set aside, and you have to kind of shop around for some of these items or services that you're saying that you need. I need you to help me gather up estimates to submit with your plan. A lot of the clients I worked with weren't willing to put the work in. Okay. Oh, they said, "Oh, that's too much. I'm not willing to take the time to do that." And so, without taking the time to do a reasonable budget and determining how much they can afford to set aside and doing some comparison shopping, Social Security is not going to consider them a viable candidate if all their ducks aren't in a row. Okay. So they have to be able to or be willing to put the work into um, putting their plan together too, in terms of figuring how much they can afford to save, putting a budget together, and doing some comparison shopping for some of these expenses. In my experience, if a client has estimates from multiple vendors or providers for an item or service, I would always submit those estimates with a copy of the past plan, because Social Security may ask for them later. And if you submit the estimates with the past plan, it just makes your life a little bit easier. It's one less thing they're going to ask you for later. So something to keep in mind as you're putting together the past plan with the client, it would be helpful to submit estimates for the service with the plan. And on the plan, when you talk about what the cost of the item or service is, I would list the lowest estimate, because again, Social Security is probably going to approve the plan at the lowest estimate when you have multiple quotes. Okay, so that is the past plan itself. Let's go back to the PowerPoint now. And I'm not going to take too much time on this next slide because we just talked about what the specific elements of the past were. But again, Social Security is going to want to talk about what the client's work and earnings goal is, their medical and vocational background in terms of what their disabilities are, and whether they have high school or college or specific training related to work goal, the steps needed to reach the goal and anticipated completion dates. And, sometimes clients aren't going to know exactly when um, certain things are going to start and stop. Like they're not going to know exactly when they're going to get hired, for an example. The last step on a pass could be listed as I'm going to get the job in my field, but there's really no way to predict when that's going to happen exactly. It takes time to put out resumes and go on interviews, and then even after the interview, people have to wait for the employer to get back to them. So when you're listing the steps needed and doing a completion date, it's okay to put an anticipated or estimated completion date in there, um, because sometimes you never know concretely when certain things are going to start and stop. So putting an estimate in there is fine. You just can't leave it blank. List of expenses and cost, funding the plan and saving for expenses. In other words, again, what income is going to be put aside into the pass. Look how much in living expenses does the client have. Attach a copy of their budget with the plan, maybe. And then other contacts and remarks. So again, other contacts would be you as the WISA helping a client put together the plan. Let's talk a little bit about the pass approval. So one thing I didn't mention is that when you are helping a client put together the pass plan, gathering up the budget and the cost estimates and everything like that, the pass plan has to go to the Social Security pass cadre. Okay. And going back to slide 7, I'll just go back there for a second. Once the pass is actually completed and filled out, I always suggest that the WISA make 2 copies of everything that is sent in. A copy of the pass plan itself, a copy of the budget, a copy of any of the estimates. Make 2 copies of everything that you send into Social Security, 1 copy for yourself and for your own record, and 1 for the client. Okay, so make 2 copies of everything you send in. The completed pass plan must be returned to the SSA pass specialist called a pass cadre. They are folks who are Social Security employees, but their only job, their one specific job, is to review pass plans submitted to determine whether or not they're a feasible plan, and based on the plan itself, they can either approve or deny the pass. So if you're a WISA helping a client put together the pass, keep in mind that it has to go to the attention of the pass cadre, not necessarily the client's local SSA office. I've included on slide 7 here a link to the pass cadres around the country. I'm not going to take the time to go there, but if you go to this website that's on the slide, it'll give you the contact information for the pass cadre for Virginia and where to send that information to. So I've included that information on the slide for you. But keep in mind that a completed pass has to go to the pass cadre for approval, not necessarily the local office. Okay. Okay. So let's go back to talking about pass approval. So if the pass is approved, an approval letter will come from the pass cadre. Okay. And once the pass is approved, keep in mind that the client they are required to, as part of that pass approval, establish a separate account for pass funds. Okay. So the idea around that is that Social Security doesn't want a client commingling funds that were set aside for pass related expenses with money that they use for everyday living expenses. Okay. So if, for example, somebody's on SSDI and they also have wages, and they said they were going to set aside a portion of their wages into a pass, they can't put their wages that they're putting into the pass plan in the same account as their SSDI. Social Security wants the client to keep their pass funds separate because um, pass plan pass plan funds can only be used for the specific steps and services that were outlined in the plan. So, for example, if somebody gets an approved pass and they said, I'm going to use these pass funds to pay for my tuition, my books, and fees, they can't also then turn around and use those pass funds for rent or living expenses. Those expenses have to be used for the specific purpose that Social Security allowed the client to save them. So if they say, I'm going to use the client for tuition, or they say I'm going to use the funds for tuition rather, they have to use it for that purpose. That's why Social Security wants the client to keep the pass funds separate. There's nothing special about a pass plan account. It can be a regular checking or savings account. Any money that's put into a pass does not count against that $2,000 resource limit for non-exempt SSI funds. So just keep that in mind. A client can have a separate bank account with those funds in it. And as long as they're approved pass funds, that separate account that they have is going to be exempt towards counting toward the resource limit. So they don't have to worry about resources for the duration of the pass. Okay. So that just covers the last 2 bullet points on the slide here. Remember, approved pass funds cannot be commingled with other funds and can only be used to pay for pass approved expenses. And pass funds do not count as resources. Now, here's the one last thing I want to say about only using pass funds to pay for approved expenses. Again, they can't use them for any other purpose. If they do, Social Security can periodically ask for a review of the pass um, to review where that money is going. So for example, say a person gets approved, and going back to our example of Pam, she says, I'm going to spend the $1,000 every quarter that I save on tuition. Social Security might come back to pay them in 6 months and say, okay, well, we approved your past plan. We're giving you a small amount of SSI now. You said that you were going to spend $1,000 every 3 months on tuition. We want to see the receipts verifying that you spent the money on what you said you were going to spend it for. And then Pam would be responsible for sending that information to the past cadre. So during the duration of the plan, Social Security may do periodic follow-ups to make sure that the client is um, following the plan as they agreed to. And so they need to keep accurate records in terms of keeping bank statements to show how much money was taken out of the account, the past account. They want to keep copies of any receipts showing what they spent the money for, because Social Security is going to want that information as they do a review. If they find out that a client is not following the past as directed, and they're not using the money in the past for what the expenses that they said that they would use them for, Social Security might charge them with an SSI overpayment, because the only reason that the client is getting SSI now is because they said, I'm going to be using the past funds that you're exempting for a specific purpose. If the client does not use the past plans for that purpose, then Social Security can say, well, you were never entitled to SSI because we only approved you for SSI because you said you were going to follow the plan. You didn't, you're overpaid. So if a client does not follow that plan as directed, they can be charged with an SSI overpayment. So that's why it's important to make sure that the funds are kept separately as the client agrees to, and that's why it's important to save copies of any receipts or bank records showing where the money went. Again, changes to the past plan are allowed. If a client has something like a medical setback, or if they want to change the amount of money that they put aside, that's okay. They just have to communicate that to Social Security and request changes in writing. A client will not get an SSI overpayment notice if they can't follow their past plan for a legitimate reason like that. As long as the client communicates to Social Security that they have to put their pass on hold, or they're not going to be able to follow it for a medical reason or any other reason, um, they're not going to get an SSI overpayment letter. The only way that would happen is if the client willfully and knowingly didn't follow their pass as directed and just used the money frivolously. Then they could. But if it's a legitimate reason why they can't follow the pass, there will be no overpayment. So make sure if you're a WISA that's helping a client develop a pass, that they understand that they have to follow the plan as written, or at the very least, if they can't, communicate that with Social Security, because if they don't follow it as written and they spend the money frivolously, then they could be overpaid. And I kind of got a little bit ahead on the slides. This next slide talks about what I just covered. A client must keep detailed income and expense records like receipts and bank statements, because again, Social Security is going to do that periodic review. Again, a failure to follow the plan as written may result in an SSI overpayment. That's not going to happen as long as the client is following a plan as written, and as long as they can produce receipts and bank statements showing that, yes, my past plan was approved for, like, say, tuition expenses. As long as they can show that the client is using the funds in the past plan that Social Security has allowed them to save as agreed upon, there's going to be no overpayment as long as they're following that plan. And again, past plans can be amended in writing if something changes with the client's circumstances where they can't follow the plan. They can either suspend it for a period of time, or they can terminate it, or they can add additional expenses to the plan, or change the amount of money that they put aside. Amendments are allowed for the duration of the pass. if something changes, as long as those are done in writing. Next slide is talking about past denials. If for some reason the pass that's written is denied, the client will also be getting a letter, and in the letter, it'll explain why the pass was denied. The pass cadre might not feel that it's a feasible plan for one reason or another. And if a client gets a pass denial letter, they do have the right to appeal that decision, just like they would any other Social Security denial. So just keep in mind that if the pass does get denied, the client does have appeal rights. If they disagree with the decision, they have to appeal in writing, and in the letter, it would give the client specific information as to how to appeal. So just want to take a few minutes to talk about past plan and how that relates to WISA. So some of you might already know this if you've developed past plans with clients. And this is important if you are a counselor listening to this also, a VR counselor. But helping a client write, develop, and submit a plan is a billable WISA service. If you're a counselor, there are two procedure codes that you need to keep in mind. There are two procedure codes in AWARE that you can use. The first one is A3005, and that's under the WISA budget in AWARE. And the second one is A3006. A3005 covers the initial development of helping the WISA helping a client develop the actual past plan. That covers helping the client write the plan, submit their budgets, submit their estimates to Social Security for approval, that sort of stuff. So if you're a counselor and you're authorizing this past plan, you're going to want to look for a couple things when the WISA bills for this. So number one, the WISA should attach a copy of the original authorization that you as the counselor sent them. Also, they're going to want to attach a copy of the plan they submitted to Social Security on the client's behalf, a copy of any of the budgets, any of the expenses that they submitted as an estimate, any of those expenses that the WISA, or any of those documents rather, that the WISA has submitted on behalf of the client should accompany that invoice when they bill for it. So that as a counselor, those are the kinds of things that you want to look for before you pay for the past service that you authorize. A3006, that's the second code in under the WISA budget and AWARE that falls under PASS, covers any amendments or modifications needed to the PASS. Okay. So an example of a modification needed might be after the WISA submits a copy of the PASS plan to the PASS cadre. Social Security might say, well, this could be a feasible plan, but we want the client to submit more estimates. Or we think the budget's a little off and they need to go back and reconfigure the budget. A3006 would cover any modifications or amendments needed to that original PASS plan that would allow the WISA to get paid for helping the client with any modifications needed to the PASS plan in order for Social Security to approve it. So keep that in mind. It is a billable service. If you have clients that you think may be eligible for a PASS plan, you can authorize as a counselor a WISA to help a client put together the plan by using A3005 for the initial PASS plan writing and submission, and A3006 to cover any modifications. And again, those are both in AWARE under the WISA budget. Slide 13 covers what I just talked about, but this is applicable to both counselors and WISAs. Keep in mind that payment for the initial PASS development is $300 per referral. And again, in order to receive that $300 payment, you as the WISA would have to submit a copy of the completed pass that you submitted to Social Security, the budgets and any estimates that you submitted, anything that went to Social Security on the client's behalf, you should submit a copy to the VR counselor for payment of that $300. And then if there are any amendments needed, if Social Security comes back to you as the WISA and says, well, we think this is a viable plan, but we need you to change X, Y, and Z before we can approve it, you can go back to the counselor and say, I need another authorization to help with the amendments. And if there are amendments needed, you can get $550 per referral for your work to help a client put those amendments in place and get the past plan paid. Okay. If you're working on an amended past plan, a copy of any amendments that you make should go to the counselor for payment also. If you're working on an amendment, what you would do is you would submit another 545, another plan for achieving self-support plan to Social Security, but at the top of it, you would write something like amendment so the past cadre knows you have a plan that you submitted previously, and this is just an amendment. And on that plan, you would detail whatever those amendments are, whether it be changing the amount of money that a client sets aside, adding expenses to it, those sort of things. You would cover that all on the amended SSA 545. On the very last slide, I just wanted to go through some resources for the WISAs and the counselors. And if you're a WISA and if your counselor has authorized a PASS plan, one of the things that I would suggest that you do is look at this PASS feasibility questionnaire that I've included on this slide, and I'll take a minute to pull it up for you so you can see what that looks like. This is something that I used regularly when I was doing direct services. This is kind of a screening tool that can help you as the WISA determine whether or not a client could be a feasible PASS candidate before you actually start doing all the work. PASS, as you can probably tell from what I reviewed on the form and on the slides, it can sometimes be a lot of work to put together a feasible plan and to gather all the estimates and get Social Security to approve it. So before you invest the time and the resources into actually putting the plan together, stands to reason that you want to make sure that the client's feasible first, right? So one of the first things you're always going to want to do if you get an authorization for a PASS plan from a counselor is to do this screening questionnaire with the client first. Okay. So the first thing is it's going to ask is the client receiving SSI already, yes or no? And remember, if they're not already on SSI, they can become SSI eligible using a PASS plan. But if they're not already on SSI, they're going to want to contact Social Security right away and apply for SSI and let them know that I'm applying for SSI because I've got a PASS plan that Social Security is working on approving, and I need to be an SSI recipient. So if the client is not already on SSI and they have a feasible PASS plan that Social Security is working on, they're going to want to contact Social Security and make sure they file that SSI application. What income or resources are going to be set aside into the PASS? So this is where you would detail, are they going to put aside SSDI, wages, any unearned income, resources, whatever, and how much they're going to set aside per week, month, or however often. Remember, if somebody's on SSI only and they have no unearned income or wage prospects or any other income to put into that PASS, they're not going to be a feasible candidate. Okay, so if you get an authorization from a counselor to help somebody with a PASS and their income is SSI only and they have no other income to set aside, that stopped right there. They're not going to be feasible. Okay. And it actually says that in the questionnaire, if no income other than SSI to put into a pass, not a feasible candidate. Okay. Next section is talking about monthly living expenses. Okay. This is again where the budget comes in. What are those expenses going to be? What's the client's work goal? Do they have any experience related to that work goal? Yes or no? Do they have an open case with VR? So obviously, if you're a WISA and you got a referral from a DARS counselor to help a client develop a pass plan, they would be working with VR. So you would say yes there. Does the vocational rehab counselor support the vocational goal? Yes or no? And this is a biggie that I haven't mentioned, and this is important for any VR counselors that might be listening to this. One of the things that's going to help determine if a client has a feasible work goal, remember going back to the slide I talked about, Social Security is going to evaluate whether or not the client's work goal is feasible and attainable. It helps if you, as the VR counselor, are in support of that goal. So if somebody has a goal of, say, going to nursing school, going back to our example, if it's listed in an IPE that a client's goal is to be a nurse, for example, and DARS is supporting them in school by helping with tuition and books and fees and things like that, that's a good example of VR being in support of a goal. And it often helps Social Security make the determination as to whether or not the job goal is feasible if the VR counselor supports it. If the VR counselor supports the client's goal, that's a good thing. It shows Social Security that it's not just the client's goal that they have, but it's also supported by the VR counselor, and VR counselors help them with some expenses. The support of the VR counselor is really important in determining whether or not the goal is feasible and attainable. Okay, so next section asks about any expenses that are already received or expected from an agency like VR that could help a client achieve their work goal. List any other items or services needed to achieve a work goal. And this doesn't have to be too detailed because you're going to be detailing all that stuff on the actual pass form. But again, this is kind of just a screening questionnaire to give you some ideas of some expenses that the client might need in order to achieve that goal. Think about this as kind of a brainstorming tool to help a client figure out what expenses they're going to need the pass to cover before you actually start working on it. Prior pass submitted, yes or no? And was a prior pass approved or completed, yes or no? Okay, so down at the bottom is really important. It goes back to the monthly expenses. Remember what I told you before is if the monthly expenses that a client has are not going to be able to be met on any money left out of a pass and any SSI supplement that the client has, they're not going to be a feasible candidate. So, in other words, if a client has, let's say, $2,500 a month in monthly expenses, and they don't have enough money to put aside into a pass, they're going to have less money coming in than they would prior to the pass approval. And Social Security is going to say, well, your income is higher than what your expenses are. If you were to put this money aside, we can't approve the pass plan because if we do, you're not going to be able to meet your monthly expenses. Okay, so remember, that's a biggie. They have to be able to meet their monthly expenses on any SSI supplement they get after pass approval and any money left out of the pass in order for it to be feasible. Okay, so best practice, again, if you are a WISA and a VR counselor is asking you to develop a pass plan, do this questionnaire first because it's really helpful in determining whether or not a client is a viable pass candidate. It's going to save you and the client a lot of headaches in the long run because you don't want to put the work into putting together the plan and doing the budget and the estimates and all that stuff and then Social Security to come back later and say it's not viable. So this saves you a lot of work in the long run by making sure that the plan is viable before you start it. Another thing I wanted to show you was Cornell University's Pass Online site. This is something that Cornell put together a long time ago that I used to use when I was doing direct services, where it's various tools related to Pass. It gives you an overview of what Pass is, how to put it together, how to help a client with the vocational goal piece and determining what type of work they want to do, and how the plan actually works. And so, what I've given you today in this webinar is kind of an overview of Pass and how they work and who's eligible. These resources that Cornell put together really go into the nuts and bolts of how what a pass is and how it works, who qualifies, and what the calculations are going to look like in terms of an SSI check after pass approval, that sort of stuff. Okay, I'm not going to take the time to go through it all, but I wanted to just show you what the site looks like. And if you have time and you want to go through some of these different articles on some of the different elements of the pass, I think it would be really helpful for you, especially if you have a counselor that's asked you to help a client put one together. Um, one of the tools in the PASS online website is a copy of that feasibility questionnaire that I just went over. So you can get a copy of the feasible uh, questionnaire by either clicking on the link in the slide that I gave you, or you can get it through PASS Online. And then you can register for a free account. And by registering for a free account, it'll actually bring up a PDF that you can type on. It's a PDF of the actual pass plan that you can type on and save, that you can print out. So rather than having to write it all out by hand, if you register for a free pass online account, you as a WISA could actually type the information onto the form and save it and print it out. Really helpful resource that I used to use all the time. So just keep in mind that the Pass online account is free to register, and you can use that to help a client put together the Pass applications. Okay. Now, I'm not going to take the time to log in and do all that stuff, but when you log into the account, you'll see a dashboard. It'll say about Pass, Pass application, and different resources. You click on the Pass application, that'll give you the PDF that you can type on, and you can put together the plan that way. And again, my goal with this webinar was just to kind of give you a brief overview of what Pass is and some of the elements of it. But as always, if you have any questions after you listen to this archive and look over the slides, you can email me, Michael, Michael .klinger, Klinger, at gars.virginia.gov, or you can call me at 434-989-5782. I am here to support our VR counselors and our WISAs with any questions related to benefits and work incentives, including PASS. So if you have any questions that come up, related to PASS or any other issues, please feel free to reach out at any time. That's what I'm here for. One last thing I wanted to mention before I wrap up is that if you were previously using my live webinars, for your credits for Cornell, if you were using my webinars for continuing education credits for the Cornell certification, even though this wasn't a live webinar and it's a recorded one, you can still use taking the time to view this recorded webinar as continuing education credits if you're certified through Cornell. So, you can log those into your portal at any time. This was an experiment doing this live I'm sorry, this was an experiment doing a recorded webinar rather. Over the years, I've done probably over 100 live webinars, and I found that it's really difficult for counselors and WISs alike to take the time to do a live webinar. And I take the time to set them up and put together the resources and charge as pays for interpreters and all that stuff. And a lot of time during live webinars, attendance is really low. And so I thought maybe trying some of the recorded webinar archives during the course of the year might be a little bit easier. Gives client or gives counselors and WISs rather time to review the resources on their own and listen to the webinars at your convenience. So this is an experiment we're going to try this year. We can go back to live webinars at one point if people prefer them, but I think this is a better way to make sure that people actually have the time to access the webinars that I do in the materials and to take the time to get the most out of them. So thank you again, everyone, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns about any of the material. Thank you.